The United States has launched airstrikes inside Syria. It says it's going after ISIL targets, but how important is regional involvement in the bombing? And are the US and its partners being dragged into an open-ended war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. Almost 2 weeks ago, US President Barack Obama warned he would target ISIL fighters wherever they are, in Iraq or Syria. And early on Tuesday, he followed through with that threat, with dozens of airstrikes in the city of Raqqa and elsewhere. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates are all involved in the operation. This providing the US with a level of regional legitimacy it was desperately looking for before it expanded its operations against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Before we bring in our guests, Omar Al-Salah helps set up our discussion.
Their target is the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. This activist video appears to show the aftermath of some of the attacks. The US Central Command says that a mix of fighter jets, bombers, drone and Tomahawk missiles were used against 14 ISIL targets near Al-Raqqa, Deir az-Zor, Al-Hasaka and Abu Kamal. ISIL controls large parts of Iraq and Syria. The US has been bombing the group in Iraq over the last 2 weeks to help the Iraqi army and Kurdish forces. This is part of what President Barack Obama says is his strategy to defeat ISIL.
First part of it can be successful, which is inside of Iraq. The combination of airstrikes from the coalition and the ground efforts by the Iraqi troops to regain lost territory is certainly an objective that's attainable in the next few months. It becomes a little more problematic when we're talking about efforts inside of Syria. The U.S. aim is, at this point, to arm and equip the moderate Syrian rebel groups so they can not only destroy Daesh, but also the Syrian government as well.
Syria had said any operation within its territory should be coordinated with Damascus. And it appears the Syrian government knew about this attack and has maintained a high level of communication with the Iraqi government. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Jordan, the UAE and Qatar were also involved in the attack, but it's not clear what role they played. Jordan, which has borders with Iraq and Syria, is nervous about the ISIL advancement.
There has been several attempts to infiltrate across our borders. We are striking the positions of ISIS because we think that we should do whatever necessary in order to strengthen and enhance and solidify the stability and security of our borders and our country.
The US says there is a wide regional and Western cooperation behind its strikes. It is not clear what the outcome of these strikes will be and whether if they will benefit President Assad or the Syrian opposition. But many people are uncertain that the aerial campaigns alone can defeat ISIL. Omar Saleh, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's bring in our guest. Joining me here in the studio in Doha is Martin Reardon, Senior Vice President of the Soufan Group. In London, we have Fawaz Gerges, Chair of Contemporary Middle Eastern Studies at the London School of Economics, and the author of The New Middle East, Protest and Revolution in the Arab World. And in Beirut, I'm pleased to say we're joined by Gareth Porter, independent investigative journalist and a historian writing about US national security policy. Welcome to you all. Martin Reardon, I'd like to start with you in the studio here. This question of regional involvement is very important, isn't it? Here we have 5 Arab countries, 5 Arab nations who have cooperated in this first batch of strikes. And this really is the legitimacy, the sanction, if you like, that the United States needed.
That is, it's very significant there. For the first time since the 1991 Gulf War, the United States went in for airstrikes with Arab allies, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Qatar. Very significant, as you say, that's the legitimacy that the Obama administration needed to make this work.
And presumably he wouldn't have gone ahead without it.
I think we would have struck without the assistance. I think we would have gone anyway. He stated 2 weeks ago that they're going to go in. But all along, for the last number of weeks, it's been a strong push to build this coalition. I think it was just anticipated that, yes, there was going to be support from the Arab allies actually striking targets.
Right. And far as judges, I mean, here you have, as I say, 5 Arab nations cooperating on something that would have been perceived as unthinkable not that long ago. It is an extraordinary turn of events, isn't it?
It really is. And this tells you a great deal about how the advances by the so-called Islamic State have changed the strategic architecture. It has threatened not only the established, state systems, but even regional security. You have 2 leading states, competing rivals in the region, Saudi Arabia and Iran, see eye to eye. That now the so-called Islamic State threatens the security of the Saudi kingdom and Iran itself. And both foreign ministers yesterday made it very clear that they see eye to eye on the threat by Daesh. Let me be clear here about one particular point. The Americans are not short, do not suffer from any shortages of fighter jets and cruise missiles or even air power. The main function of this particular coalition, as you said, is legitimacy. To deny the accusation that this is a unilateral American operation. The second point I want to stress regarding this particular point is that this president, Barack Obama, has made it very clear all along that the Americans will not fight what he calls local and regional powers' basic struggles. That the United States would provide command and control, logistic support, but local and regional powers must fight their own wars. This is he wants to distinguish himself from his predecessor, President George W. Bush. And he also wants to convince the Americans that this is not really Iraq, a second war similar to the Iraq campaign, that this is basically a different campaign, that regional powers are deeply involved, and the American is providing leadership, command and control, and air power.
Yeah, absolutely. But I was going to say that here you have regional powers involved, but they're not exactly conducting their own war, are they?
No, not at all. I mean, let's be clear here. This is an American campaign. This is basically an American campaign in terms of targets, in terms of planning, in terms of logistics, in terms of cruise missiles, in terms of targets. Of course, regional powers can provide logistics and intelligence, in particular Jordan. Jordan has an impressive intelligence capacity in Syria and Iraq. But the reality is most of the attacks are conducted by the Americans. The regional powers don't have the capacity to really carry out large-scale and long strikes into a different country. So this is an American campaign, and the participation of key Arab states not only lends legitimacy to President Barack Obama, but also provides the cover for the president to convince the American people and the international community that this is a broadly based coalition with American leadership as opposed to being a unilateral American operation.
Now, Gareth Porter, these nations do not see eye to eye on all issues. There are several problems that they have in cooperating, but here they are cooperating on this particular offensive. Does that give a fragility to the coalition?
Well, I think that the coalition that we're talking about here does indeed provide the kind of optic advantage to the United States. That is to say, it does legitimize in the view of the international community far more than would otherwise be the case, the U.S. military operations. I happen to think that that's really quite unfortunate because it makes it easier for the United States to venture into a conflict that I think it's going to be, in the longer run, very clear the United States is going to make another mess of. I think that it's extremely unfortunate that the way in which this new war is being approached in the news media has either forgotten or denied the reality that over a series of wars in the Middle East, over the past decade in particular, the U.S. military has made a hash of it over and over again. It does not have the capability to target the so-called militants, whether it's in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, or in Syria, so that it can avoid a process of escalation of U.S. involvement because initial efforts will be unsuccessful.
Okay, we're going to get into that really nitty-gritty in a little bit, but just isn't the mere fact that these regional powers are involved actually dilutes the impact of what you're saying there to a degree?
Well, I don't see how it dilutes the impact, because I think what really counts is what happens on the ground in Syria from now on. And the fact that the Saudis, the UAE, Jordan are somehow involved in this is not going to change the impact on the ground of what the United States does militarily. I think what is far more important is whether the targeting can be precise enough to avoid the obvious missteps that the United States has made in the past over and over again.
Okay, Gareth Porter, what do you think, these 5 Arab nations so far who've contributed to the offensive, what do you think their involvement has been? Because we don't actually know, do we?
Well, we do. It's come out publicly that 4 of the countries were actually involved in the airstrikes, dropping bombs on targets. And that is significant.
So they were actually flying the country's own planes and using their air crews.
And when you look at air forces like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, they have a mix of aircraft, but a lot of that aircraft is U.S. aircraft, which means they train with the U.S. Air Force. There's a couple things I want to comment on. Your speaker from Beirut, I agree with with everything he said. With one exception, I don't look at this as a U.S. campaign, unilateral. This is a U.S.-led campaign, and that was the goal all along. The United States has the assets to help make this work. It was never going to work without the coalition. And keep in mind, too, we have other silent partners right now, at least from the first night, that will certainly be coming on in the future. Great Britain, France, Germany has agreed to train Peshmerga forces on anti-tank weapons. So there are other players that I think in the coming days you're going to see. But I would categorize this as a U.S. or Western-led campaign. But that coalition of Arab partners is crucial, and it won't succeed without them.
Yeah, okay, so Gareth Porter, what about that? So this is a US-led campaign, not a US campaign in its own right.
Well, I think the real question here is what is going to happen after the first round of strikes in Syria fails to have a decisive effect. The inevitable consequence, it seems to me, of that situation is that the United States will broaden geographically the strikes in Syria. That inevitably increases the chances of the kind of missteps of targeting that is mistaken, that it hits civilians, obviously. I think that's inevitable that that's going to be happening. And I think the possibility of a clash between the United States and Syrian forces also increases as you broaden the geographical scope of U.S. involvement. And finally, I think that we have to take seriously the likelihood that the U.S. will indeed be committing at least special operations forces on the ground in Syria. They're already there in Iraq. I cannot believe that will not also happen in Syria in the coming weeks and months.
It's true to say, if I was Judges, doesn't it, that this opens up a bottomless can of worms. Surely to do this effectively, they'd have to have close involvement with the Syrian government about ISIL positions as far as this offensive is concerned. But always, somewhere down the line, there is rearing its ugly head is Obama's reckoning with President Assad, isn't there?
You're absolutely correct. Wars are transformative. You start with a particular goal, you end up somewhere else. This is the history of warfare. It's not just about Iraq and Syria. The critical question is not whether this is a led American campaign or a unilateral American campaign. The critical questions are, what are the prospects of efficacy, of success? What kind of operations are going to unfold in the next few weeks and next few months? I would argue there's a great deal of uncertainty. There are great risks. It's a moment pregnant with serious consequences. You cannot defeat the so-called Islamic State by air power alone, regardless of how potent American air power. This is not my words. This is many American generals have made it very clear. You need large number of boots on the ground to basically defeat the so-called Islamic State. Already, we know we have many reports that fighters and militant and extremists basically are moving their forces into urban areas. That means urban warfare. You need to dislodge, if you're really serious about degrading and weakening and squeezing the so-called Islamic State, you need boots on the ground in order to dislodge the so-called Islamic State from major cities and towns. Al-Mosul, Tikrit, Fallujah, Al-Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, regardless of how many thousands of air power campaigns you can do. And the reality on the ground, there are no boots on the ground, there are no local forces in 1 or 2 years to really face up to this particular problem, not just the so-called Islamic State, Al-Nusra Front and other militant groups as well. So the reality is the Americans-led campaign has begun this particular campaign with airstrikes. What do you do in the next few weeks, next few months?
All right, let's put that to Martin Ridden. Thanks, Fawaz. Well, let's put that to Martin Ridden. Fawaz there saying that regardless of how many airstrikes you conduct, you will still need boots on the ground at some point in time.
I agree with both speakers wholeheartedly. And this has been proved throughout history. Airstrike or air power is very important, but without having that ground component, it has quite a few limitations. And if you even look in Iraq, there's been significant number of airstrikes in the last several weeks there, and yet Daesh or ISIL is still firmly in place. There's not a very effective ground force going against them with the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga, but they are certainly more effective than anything in the near future that could possibly be on the ground in Syria. That's the weak link in the whole strategy.
Do you think the U.S. administration, they're aware that they're going to, at some point, boots in the ground, may not be U.S. boots, but some sort of ground force will have to go in. They are aware of this. General Dempsey even alluded to that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's going to have to be boots on the ground. The coalition agreement now is that's going to be moderate rebels. But again, this is something that is not done in a matter of days or a week. It could take months to train them to have an effective force. The most effective force on the ground in Syria right now is Daesh, by far.
Right. Okay. Moderate rebels are there, but what about the boots on the ground? Gareth Porter in Beirut. Whose boots will they be? What nations will provide these ground forces?
Well, it certainly is not going to be Syrian opposition forces, I think it's safe to say. I mean, the most optimistic estimate of the amount of territory that the so-called moderate opposition forces occupy or control is 5% in Syria. And that's not going to change very dramatically anytime soon. So they're simply not going to be a significant factor in this conflict. And that really does beg the question, okay, who are these forces that we're supposed to be preparing to really fight the war? It's not at all clear that there is such a force. And I think that's why, as the previous speaker has said, and as General Dempsey has suggested, we are going to be looking at the strong likelihood that U.S. forces will be introduced in some fashion at some point in the relatively near future. And again, I mean, you know, as a historian, I have to say that you look back on what happened in Iraq and you look at what happened in Afghanistan, and the boots on the ground that the United States has introduced in those countries have been utterly disastrous from the beginning to the end. And therefore, the idea that the United States is capable of providing any kind of solution here, it's simply ridiculous. It's risible.
Okay, and in the meantime, we're going to see more of these airstrikes. And what's interesting to me here is this concept of what cooperation there was between the US and the Syrian government. Let's just hear what the Syrian Foreign Ministry had to say about these airstrikes.
Yesterday, our ambassador to the UN was informed that the US and some of its allies will carry out strikes against ISIL in the areas they are holding in Syria. The Syrian ambassador received a letter from the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, through the Iraqi foreign minister, informing him that they will strike against ISIL inside Syria. Syria is obviously fighting ISIL in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. We are still fighting terrorism and will coordinate with the countries allies who will fight terrorism, including Iraq.
So is that it, Fawaz Gerges? John Kerry sends a letter and the Syrian government says, fine, just come on in.
Absolutely. If you read the Foreign Ministry's statement today, fully welcoming the American airstrikes inside Syria. No complaints, no reluctance, nothing whatsoever. Quickly, by the way, since we've been talking about boots on the ground, I think we need to think of short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Regardless of how effective American strikes and the allies in the long term, in the short term, I think they can stop the advances of Daesh or the so-called Islamic State. This is for sure. Daesh cannot really expand in the same pace that it has in the last few months. Point one. Point two, about boots on the ground. The Iraqi government has already made it very clear it won't accept boots on the ground in Iraq. Point two. Point three, the American strategy in Syria is to paralyze Daesh or the Islamic State and strengthen the moderate opposition forces in order to establish the mechanisms and the conditions for a diplomatic settlement in the midterm and long term. In the meantime, the airstrikes will continue, as the Defense Department has made it very clear, on a daily basis.
Martin Reardon, if you are successful, if the US and their allies are successful in paralyzing ISIL, who steps into the gap that they leave?
That's the big question. Nobody knows who's going to come out of the shadows from Daesh. Is it going to be a stronger al-Nusra? Is it going to be a new terrorist organization, some of the Horizon, which just comes into public light a week ago? Nobody knows what's going to happen. I think it's safe to say, though, that ISIL can be significantly degraded. Somebody else is going to come in there.
In your view, what does success look like for the United States?
I think success looks, first of all, to put Daesh out of Iraq. And that's the big threat right there, is not so much threats against the West, it's regional instability, where you have ungoverned spaces in western Iraq and Syria. Get them out of Iraq now, in the coming months. And that was the whole reason for those airstrikes initially, was to give the Iraqis and the Peshmerga time to regroup and rearm. Get them out of there. But they have a safe haven in Syria. And that's a big challenge. We can hit them hard initially, but again, as all three of us have said, without having somebody on the ground to fight them who's more effective at fighting than Daesh is now, it's not going to succeed.
Okay, Gareth Porter, I just want to come back to, we've only got a couple of minutes left, I just want to come back to this issue of Obama's position on President Assad in Syria, because here we have US forces and their allies attacking ISIL, which actually does President Assad a favor, doesn't it? And when you spin that on down the line, where are we left?
Well, the problem here, of course, is that US policy towards Syria, as everywhere else in the Middle East, is fundamentally a function far more of US domestic politics than it is a response to realities on the ground in the region. And that's why, I think the Obama administration has been pushed in the direction of a threat to go to war against Syria more than a year ago, ultimately not taking that decision, but again, at this point, is subject to the domestic political forces that in the news media and in party politics seem to push the United States toward more conflict with Assad and toward a military commitment to go against the regime in Syria.
Gareth, I'm going to jump in there. I'm just going to leave last word. We've only got 30 seconds left. Fawaz Gerges, I can see you want to come in there. Just literally 30 seconds, all you have.
Absolutely. If I were Assad in Syria, I would be terrified. I would be anxious, not about the attacks against Daesh and the al-Nusra Front, against basically the evolution of this particular coalition into something else. What would happen in the midterm? Could this particular coalition turn its fire against Assad himself in Damascus? This is the big question I would be thinking about if I were Assad in Damascus today.
Okay, Fawaz Gerges, you must have a watch on because that's 30 seconds exactly. We appreciate that very much, gentlemen. It's all we have time for. Do appreciate your time. Fawaz Gerges, Gareth Porter and Martin Reardon here in the studio. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks very much indeed for watching. Do please feel free to add your voice to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter, of course. Look for @AJ Inside Story. From me and the rest of the team, it's goodbye for now.